Welcome to the Education Insights Focus on Behavior podcast. We're here to talk about all things behavior in the world of education. We take the science of behavior and break it down for educators into easily implementable steps, and we're excited to spend some time with you. Get ready to talk through behavior, what works, what doesn't work, and how we can all improve our work in schools so we as educators can be more fulfilled and our students can be more successful.
Welcome back to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. I'm your host, Dr. Selena Layden. As always, I'm joined by my co-host today, Dr. Daria Lorio-Barston. Hi, Daria.
Hi, everyone.
And Daniel Irwin. Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
And our producer, Emily Muse. Hi, Emily.
Hello there.
All right. Well, today we are going to have a little conversation that Daniel's going to lead us in.
Welcome, everybody, to America's new favorite game show. It is called Pokemon or Pharmaceutical. And I'm going to say a word. And you, Emily, please play along. I'll be keeping score. You have to tell me whether this word is a Pokemon or it is a pharmaceutical. Does everyone understand the rules? All right. I don't know how we're going to do this. Maybe you could write it on a card or something and hold it up, or just call it out loud. Maybe we just go around the board. Is everyone ready to get started?
Sure.
Our first word is Quilava. Quilava.
I say pharmaceutical.
I'm going to say Pokemon.
Pokemon.
Emily and Selena, congratulations. Quilava is a Pokemon. I'll see if I can find a description of said Pokemon, but there's a really long list. Do you know how many Pokemon there are? All right, round two. Get ready for Rayquaza. Rayquaza.
Pokemon.
I'm going to go with Pokemon.
Daria says Pokemon.
Pokemon.
I'll go pharmaceutical.
Daria and Selena, you are correct. Rayquaza is a Pokemon. The third round is Warphalone. Warphalone.
I'm going with pharmaceutical again.
I'm going to go with pharmaceutical.
Pharmaceutical.
All right, you're all correct. Congratulations, everybody. It is a pharmaceutical. Azumarill. Azumarill.
I think this is a Pokemon.
Pokemon.
Prescription from Daria. It is a Pokemon. It is the Aqua Rabbit Pokemon, a water/fairy type known for its round blue appearance and strong belly.
Strong belly.
Yeah. I've got a lot of notes on Pokemon on this piece of paper. All right. Valios. The next word is Valios.
I'm just going to keep sticking because surely one of them will be a pharmaceutical at some point of time. I'll say Pokemon.
We'll go pharmaceutical. I don't know.
It is a pharmaceutical. Valios. I'm sorry I don't have a description. I thought I did for all of these, but I certainly Googled them to make sure it was correct. All right, let's do one more. You want to do one more?
Sure.
Carnotaur. Carnotaur.
It sounds like a dinosaur.
Yeah, I'm going Pokemon on this one.
We'll go pharmaceutical. I don't know.
Pharmaceutical.
It is a pharmaceutical.
This is excellent. My child will be gravely disappointed in my lack of knowledge of Pokemon.
Well, in fairness, I have the kids the Pokemon and the husband that's the pharmacist. So I was like, I better do okay on this.
I feel like you were the perfect target audience to be a strong player for this game.
True.
I think they would.
I think you did well. I didn't keep score.
Yeah, I didn't either.
We'll have to listen to the tape.
I think Emily and Selena definitely dominated this game. So.
Satisfaction of winning for everyone.
I will say this might be outside of my scope of practice, so that's all right.
Well, with that, Daniel, you want to connect us into our topic for the day?
That's going to be a fun segue. There is none aside
this is the whole episode. This is a special episode on Pokemons versus pharmaceuticals.
We'll do 10 more. Cellsep. There is no
Okay.
meaningful segue here aside from we'll just take a little break. That was fun. And let's have some more fun talking about specially designed instruction and where that fits in a multi-tiered system of support.
Yeah, so today we are going to talk about, we've talked about MTSS frameworks and kind of the different tiers and what does it mean to kind of work through these. And so one of the things we keep alluding to, but then don't really talk about is special education. And I know that we've said in previous episodes about MTSS that special education does not mean tier 3 instruction, but that it is, separate but related. And so we wanted to talk today about what that means because I feel like we've kind of skirted that issue a little bit as we've talked through this. So we wanted to spend a little more time specifically addressing this. So we have special education, we have MTSS. What does one have to do with the other?
It's a relatively complicated little conversation, but also not that complicated at all, right? So within a tiered system, and we have talked about tiered systems in the past, and think about tier one and that instruction that everyone receives, the supports and instruction that everyone receives. And tier two is to address a smaller group of individuals, whether it's academically or behaviorally, with supports. And tier three is sort of generally outlined and reserved for kids that need really individualized levels of support. And where special education and specially designed instruction comes in is with an IEP. And so we're talking about students specifically with a disability who have goals and objectives and accommodations and modifications, who receive specially designed instruction that is individualized, as it relates to how their disability impacts their ability to access the curriculum and instruction, and learn. And so in some ways, it can look very similar. In other ways, there are some legal protections available for kids who do have disabilities, and how they're provided those supports, and how that leads to that free and appropriate public education that they have a right to.
So I think part of what we need to talk about is I do think, as I alluded to, there's this misconception that if you receive special education services, you must be a tier 3 kid or you must be receiving tier 3 interventions. And that's not necessarily true. You might be, obviously, hopefully, you're receiving tier 1 interventions because everybody should be receiving those regardless. But you may receive tier 3 interventions for some things. You may receive tier 2 interventions for some things. You may not need more intensive interventions. But what you do require is specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of to meet your unique needs because of your disability. And so if you have a learning disability, you may receive special education services for those needs, but that can be separate from other interventions that you receive because you happen to be struggling in math or you happen to be struggling in reading or science or whatever the case may be.
I think this is a conversation, Selena, you mentioned something, right? And I think sometimes when people do shortcuts of accidentally placing kids in tiers and calling them like tiered kids versus tiered interventions, I think this is where in reality there gets to be a lot of confusion. Because I think even for our students with disabilities who do have an IEP and who do have minutes and services and SDI provided, it doesn't mean that they don't get to participate in all other things in the school, right? And so I think the special education and MTSS are not really a dichotomy. It's really looking into each individual child and figuring out what supports do they need where. Because to me, if you require specially designed instruction, specially designed individualized instruction does look like a tier 3 intervention, right? Like that's where it would go in the model. But at the same time, as any student walking through the doors of the school, you should also be getting access and equitable participation in all of the tier 1, those universal supports. And so I think we get into tricky pieces when we start accidentally withholding tier 2 interventions from students, just because they may have an IEP or a 504 plan. Not that we've been talking about 504 plans, but I think this is why it's really important, as we talked about in previous episodes, to have very strong decision rules about getting access and participation in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions, and what does that look like? Because on the flip side, not every child who is receiving a tier 3 support, it does not mean that automatically means that that is a special education support either.
Right. And I think sometimes thinking about things like who's providing these supports, right? If you are receiving a tier 3 intervention, that's not necessarily coming from a special education teacher, but you may receive tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions from a special education teacher if you are a student with a disability receiving special education services. So I think that's another piece of that puzzle and kind of how it fits together is, who's providing the services, where are the services happening is something to think about. I think the other thing that Daniel alluded to is really important. If you are receiving special education services, those are legally binding you have to provide those because you've agreed to do so in an IEP. MTSS doesn't have the same the legal pieces of that are a lot different. And so it's not, we've all signed an IEP agreeing to provide this. It might be that, we've decided as a team that this child needs tier 3 intervention for 6 weeks so that we can remediate some skills that need to be caught up on. And then that child doesn't need those services and supports anymore. Typically, a child receiving special education isn't going to only receive special education for 6 weeks and then suddenly not need those services anymore. Though we hope that with good supports and services, students with special education needs don't need as intensive of support. So I agree. I think it's a little bit tricky and I think the lines can be gray, but I do think it's really important, to your point, Daria, to have really good decision rules around when do we decide a student needs more intensive supports? How do we ensure special education services and supports are still being provided, regardless of the MTSS framework that's in place? Some of those things.
I think the other thing is is looking at some of those decision rules, right? And figuring out, looking at the data that we are grounding all of our decisions, hopefully, in, right? I think it also, we need to look and try to figure out what is the root cause of why a student is struggling, whether it is academically, behaviorally, in a social setting, whatever it is. Because I think that what we want to avoid, we don't want to continue to do only MTSS aspect if anybody suspects that there is a disability at play, right? And so I think that the two are really intended to be complementary and figuring out how to make MTSS truly inclusive for all students while not slowing down evaluation for the sake of following one process with forgetting the legal aspects of the other.
Yes. And I think one key aspect to that is when you receive special education services, you do have to have an identified disability. And that identified disability needs to be impacting you in school somehow. And then that IEP is written to address that. That student may have other needs that are not that don't need to be addressed through special education. And I think that's where MTSS is that perfect complement to say, well, we don't need special education for this, but we still have needs that need to be addressed. And so how can we ensure that that student is still receiving the supports that they need to be successful?
I think we also need to figure out, hypothetically, in this conversation, this makes a pretty neat example of how they can go together, right? And when they're different. I think sometimes in practice it gets really, really murky when we're looking at where do special educators fit in providing MTSS services, right? Or I shouldn't even call them MTSS services, and providing like MTSS supports. And I think another part of that becomes when we talk about even our MTSS teams in schools, because if we're going to talk about that, we need to make sure it is truly an efficient and inclusive practice that we all are engaging in. Then I think we need to figure out how do we make sure that there are different voices represented in the decision making and in making those decision rules. Because sometimes I think that our special education teachers have a tendency to get excluded from the MTSS team if we're looking just at tier ones and at tier one supports. And I think that their voices are really important. So I don't know if we want to go down that path. I don't know if we want to talk about where do how do we play together in the sandbox, right? And how do we support MTSS without providing an additional expectation for our special education teachers?
I think that's such a good point, and kind of having, thinking about some of the classrooms that I've supported, I've got kind of two things that I think are important considerations to look at. And one is really thinking about that fidelity of the tiered system that that student is living in, right? And so we've talked about kind of those data rules around moving to tier two, moving out, right, of different tiers. But also the consideration of what IEPs look like in a certain context will change based on what that tiered system offers. And so, it's two things that are happening at the same time. We're trying to address the needs of the individuals with disabilities and how those disabilities access or impact their access to the curriculum and instruction in school and all of that. At the same time, building a system within their environment that can bridge that offers those supports on a regular basis. So it's access to them, and it's the actual implementation of tier one, two, and three supports that may or may not impact the content of what's in a student's IEP and how they're getting individualized services. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that goes back to two. I think it's really incredibly important to understand why a student is receiving special education services. If a student has a hearing impairment, then that IEP needs to be crafted to ensure that that student can obviously access and benefit from the curriculum, despite the fact that they have a hearing impairment, right? If they have an orthopedic impairment, can they get from classroom to classroom? And these are simplistic examples. But understanding why a student's receiving special education services, I think then helps make decisions in that MTSS framework of, is this something that the IEP needs to address? Or is this something that we need to address through our MTSS framework to ensure that the student's still getting what they need? Because at the end of the day, that's the important part. But also this idea of, is it special ed? Is it MTSS? But MTSS and special ed they're not the same thing. Like they complement each other, but they are different and they serve slightly different purposes.
One thing that I hope that our listeners can take away from this is the importance of having the conversations between our general education teachers and educators and providers and special education teachers, paraeducators, paraprofessionals, additional services providers. I think the more we are able to have these discussions, the more we are able to see how do special design instruction and MTSS, how do they fit, and how do they fit in the way that is effective and makes sense, right? Because I think that all of us tend to have some blind spots, and all of us tend to lean heavily into our own expertise, and sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so having those voices is really important as we're building the system, as we're even looking at tier one supports, as we're looking at tier two supports, as we're looking at tier three supports, so that there isn't a de facto rule that says, oh, if tier two supports aren't working, then that's an automatic referral to special education, right? So that was my contribution of advice that is probably easier said than done.
Yeah, to kind of wrap this up, I think it's messy. I think there's gray. I don't think that there's a clear black and white rule that we can give people to follow. But I do think this idea of collaborating, having conversations, making sure that you know why you're making the decisions you're making, I think that those are good places to start as you kind of try to untangle what's special ed, what's MTSS, how do they work together, and how do we ensure that at the end of the day, the student is successful or as successful as they can be in the supports that we can provide. All right, with that, let's talk about our resource for the day.
All right, so the resource that may be helpful as you're trying to tease out and also combine MTSS and special education is a brief that you can find on the National Center on Education Outcomes website, and we will also post it in the notes. It's called MTSS for All, including students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. So it is a joint publication between the National Center on Educational Outcomes and the TIES Center, which is the Time in General Education, Instructional Effectiveness, and Engagement and Support Center, coming from University of Minnesota. And what the brief does, it gives you very nice, succinct information, probably much more succinct than our conversation today, where it walks through some of those differences and how to truly help MTSS framework to become more inclusive in the school setting, to include all students, including students with significant cognitive disabilities. I personally really appreciate the brief that comes with figures where you have nice visuals to see what it can look like, and give some nice examples between academic and behavioral and emotional growth of our students as well. So if this is something that's of interest to you, I encourage you to check out that brief that has lots of great information.
Great. Thanks, Daria. And of course, as always, we will link that in the show notes if you're interested. And with that, we will sign off for today. So thank you, Daria and Daniel.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
And thanks to our listeners. We will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for listening to Education Insights Focus on Behavior. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can join the conversation by emailing us at cbis@odu.edu, visiting www.cbisva.org, or following us on Facebook, Instagram, X, or Blue Sky at CBISVA. Special thanks to the Virginia Department of Education for their support of this project.